Welcome to our time together in online church. We are giving a preview of the sermon that's coming up this coming Sunday, and we're also asking you to think about using it in your small groups. So we give a little overview of the sermon, and then we give you some questions in your small group, so we hope that this will help you as you go forward. So in the return, we're talking about how we find ourselves in a difficult time, unable to be together because of COVID, separated from each other because of a number of differences. And so the question that we're asking is, how do we find our way back? So in the return, we're discovering that we can always return. And we've been looking at a few themes throughout the series. One is when we find ourselves outside, God brings us back inside. That we can return through forgiveness, and that we can return by seeking God. And we learned that there's not a quick exit or a quick return. As we've been saying, there's no shortcut through the land of the shadow. John Bailey says in the Diary of Private Prayer, "When you call me to go through the dark valley, let me not persuade myself that I know a way around." And so as we're going through this series, we hope that you're taking these different themes and thinking about them for your own return, because I know that a lot of us are really working through a various amount of things, and I hope that this will be of value to you. When we return, we find a spiritual transformation. And today we're going to talk about returning from grief. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about returning from original sin. And then last week, we talked about returning from exile. And so today we're going to talk about returning from grief, relational grief and the grief of loss. And we'll find there's kind of two ideas here, that to return from grief, we need to move from unforgiveness to forgiveness. And that we need to move from the grief that causes us to suffer to healing. And today we're going to look at Genesis 50. And it's the story of Joseph, which actually starts in Genesis 37. And here's just a short overview of that. You know, the story begins in Genesis 37 when Joseph was 17. He was his father Jacob's favorite. The Bible actually says this to designate that there was going to be trouble ahead, because as you know, and as I know, when you have favorites within a parenting situation, it only causes problems. Jacob's favor is signified by a fabulous coat that he gives to Joseph. And then soon after that fabulous coat is given, he, the son, Joseph, has a dream whose transparent meaning is that the brothers are going to be beneath him. So he has a dream in which he's a sheaf, and then a bunch of other sheaves, sort of like a Disney Fantasia kind of take, bow down to him. That means that they are lesser than him. And this really makes them mad. Then he has another dream in which the sun, moon, and 11 stars bow down to him, and he tells this to his brothers and to his father Jacob. And of course, the transparent meaning there is that not only are the brothers going to bow down to him, but also Jacob the father is going to do that. So with these dreams, the coat, along with Joseph's naivete, maybe the kind of attitude that you would see that's altered by somebody who just becomes a favorite, a hatred builds up between Joseph and the brothers. And to further this, Joseph is kind of used as a spy by his father. So he goes out into the field, watches brothers work, and then he brings back a bad report about his brothers' work in the field. And their work as livestock owners would take them days away from home. And Jacob, assuming that as the father, his sons would just put up with his decisions, sends Joseph to get another report. And so when the other brothers, 10 in total this time, see him coming, they plot to kill him. And this reminds us of Jacob and Esau, where Esau wanted to kill Jacob. So the attitudes in this are really, really extreme. Reuben, the oldest, talks to the other brothers, and he talks them out of killing Joseph and just says, throw him into a pit. And then for whatever reason, Reuben goes away. It's unclear where. And when he's gone, a caravan of slave traders comes, and they buy Joseph into slavery because Judah talks him into it. Can you imagine the scene as Joseph is being stripped of his coat? He's being stripped of his brotherhood with his brothers, and then he's taken away in ropes or chains, and he's taken away from them. And then we follow Joseph down to Egypt, where he serves in the house of a military man named Potiphar. And in that house, Joseph is framed for attempted rape because he refuses the advances of Potiphar's wife. He's thrown into jail, but even there, he is trusted by the captain of the guard. And this starts a really important theme where Joseph rises to power because he's so trustworthy. While he's in jail, two of Pharaoh's servants, the butler and the baker, are also thrown into jail, and each has a dream that Joseph interprets for them. One of the dreams Joseph interprets as this person is going to be restored, the butler, and the other that the person is going to lose his life. And that follows through. The butler is taken back into Pharaoh's court. The baker is executed. And as the butler's leaving, Joseph says, "Don't forget me," which, of course, the butler immediately does. He forgets Joseph for 2 years. And then Pharaoh himself has 2 dreams. And since no one can interpret these dreams, the butler says, "Hey, I know a guy." So Joseph is called in to interpret, and he says Egypt is going to have 7 good years followed by 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh's very impressed by this, puts him in charge to save up for the 7 lean years, and Joseph becomes quite powerful in the world. And then the whole world comes to get food from Egypt under Joseph's power. Sure enough, all of Jacob's household suffers under the famine, and Jacob sends them down to get food. When they get there to ask for food, they are brought into the royal court. And this is about 20 years after they've sold Joseph into slavery. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And he proceeds to test them to see if they are who they say they are. And one of the interesting things that they say is they are honest men, which is probably the worst thing that you can say to Joseph. And so Joseph begins to just kind of toy with them, first accusing them and then letting them go, provided they leave Simeon behind. And this leaving Simeon behind is a test of whether or not they care for one over all of them. So they do this, and they come back, and Jacob's like, "Why did you do that? Why did you tell them about Benjamin?" Because Joseph wants them to bring down Benjamin, because Benjamin is his full brother by Rachel. So the youngest is sent back, and they come back, and another ruse is set up where Benjamin is accused of stealing. And when they are willing, all the other brothers are willing to sacrifice themselves rather than allowing Benjamin to be taken, Joseph reveals himself. And once they see this, they are then called to go back and bring Jacob and all the family back to Egypt, which they do. And after about 20 years in Egypt, Jacob, their father, dies. And this is where Genesis 50 begins. And there's just kind of 2 points that I want to talk about. First is we return from grief by forgiving. So Genesis 50 reads this way. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, he'd passed away, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil which we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, 'Forgive, I pray you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now we pray you, forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. So the question is, why are they weeping? And I think the clear answer is that even after 20 years of being back in Egypt, even after seeing that Joseph loved them and cared for them and wanted the best for Jacob, upon Jacob's death, they make up this lie about Jacob wanting him to forgive them, and he begins to weep. And he has to suffer through and understand that in order to be able to restore what's going on within their relationship, he needs to go to another step of forgiveness, which we'll see in this next passage he does. So here's a question for you and your small group. Who do you need to forgive? And there are lots of questions that go with that. That's the big question. Who do you need to forgive? The other questions are, what happened? How have you tried to forgive? What has been the blockade around that? And the only way to come back from the grief of unforgiveness is through forgiveness. So talk about that. Here's the second point. Return from grief by seeing the hand of God. Genesis 50 goes on. His brothers also came and fell down before him. Remember, they're still trying to negotiate what's going to happen with Joseph having all this power and them no longer perceiving they have protection from their father. They fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." So in an interesting moment here, they are offering to become slaves to Joseph. But Joseph said to them, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God?" And the answer is no, he's not. And then he goes on, "As for you, You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. This very verse right here is what is meant by the sovereignty of God. And you see it all along the pathway. Joseph is sent down into Egypt. He's preserved there. Now, we're not condoning the behavior of the brothers. The brothers are called to account by that, but God brings good out of that particular situations. There are three sets of two dreams: the two dreams by Joseph, the two dreams by the butler and the baker, and the two dreams by Pharaoh. And each step along the way, there's a movement of God, and then finally the movement of God to bring all of Israel down to Egypt to preserve this nation. And so Joseph goes on. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. And thus he reassured them and comforted them. His grief here is turned toward helping the grief of others. Because remember, not only does he have the grief of needing to deal with forgiveness, he also has the grief of having lost his father. And not only does he have the grief of him having lost his father, all the other brothers have also lost their father. And so there's grief all the way around. And since he's able to hold on to the sovereignty of God, and he's able to forgive, he's then able to turn toward others and comfort them. And then the verse goes on. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. Note that Joseph lived another 44 years with his brothers. And so these instances of terrible actions by the brothers of selling him into slavery, of him being down in slavery for a number of years and then them being back together, is met by him dealing with grief that entails forgiving and working through the sovereignty of God in the midst of grief. So here's a question for small groups. Discuss a time when God confused you and talk about how you work through that. Because in this instance of grief, and I've just seen this time and time again as a pastor, no matter who it is that passes away, there's always a sense of kind of confusion. First, the confusion of death, but oftentimes it's the confusion that arises out of the circumstances that entail there. And so one of the things that we have to do in order to move through grief to healing is partly to accept and know and understand the sovereignty of God. It's not that we understand why those things happened. Joseph's story is an unusual story because we see God's sovereignty from beginning to end, and we see why something happened. Most of the time, we don't see that. We just have the opportunity to accept that God is at work. God is always intending good in every circumstance. So just as a couple of concluding word, grief is very powerful, but God is more powerful than grief. And as we're going through this time in COVID and as we're separated from each other, there's a sense of grief at the loss of that. And yet God is in control. God has something in mind. And let's assume and believe that God is actively engaged in our life to work us through grief. May the Lord bless you today.